Here in front of me, I have our new FactionFab Coilovers. In this video, we're going to show you how to set preload and ride height. As a precursor, let's talk about preload. Preload is a term used to describe the compression of the spring when the damper is already at full extension. It can be changed by moving the collars at the bottom of the spring up or down, and is often measured in either force or distance, which can be both metric or imperial units. So for example, a coilover is at 0 preload when the spring is tight between the two collars. This 0 is both the distance and the force at this point. So let's say we move the lower collar up 10 millimeters, or about 2/5 of an inch. You could simply say that we now have 10 millimeters, or 2/5 inch of preload. Now the force is determined by the spring rate. The spring on this coilover is a 10K spring, which means 10 kilograms per millimeter. So for every millimeter of compression, we have 10 kilograms of force. So at our 10 millimeter distance, you could also say that this coilover has 100 kilograms of preload. And you can do the conversion to pounds per inch, which is the usual imperial units used. Many coilovers require you to change the preload in order to change the ride height, thereby affecting your ride quality if you go outside a very small range. Since FactionFab coilovers are independent height adjustable by having a movable lower mount, we can set the preload on them to the optimal compression for performance and comfort, then set the ride height to your own taste or needs. Here's what you'll need to set them up: the coilovers, the collar wrenches, and something to measure the distance. Calipers, tape measure, or even a ruler, whatever you have will work. Let's start by making sure all the collars are loose and spin freely. Take the bottom spring seat collar and move it to 0 preload, which means full contact so that the spring can't move, but without any compression of the spring. Take the spring locking collar and move it to the bottom of the spring seat collar. We are going to keep this collar in the same place as a marker for our 0 preload. For optimal performance and comfort of the FactionFab coilovers, we want to keep preload minimal, but also have a small amount of compression so that the spring doesn't shift and make noise. Across our entire lineup, we want to have 4 millimeters of compression, or about the same thickness as our coilover wrench. So I'm going to hold the locking collar in place on the shock body and spin the spring and seat collar up the shaft, compressing the spring. Check the distance along the way until I can fit the wrench in the gap. Now I'm going to spin the locking collar up to the seat collar and tighten. Now we're ready to move on to setting the ride height. We have provided all the data that we have gathered during testing so that you can set the ride height on the coilovers before they go on the car. This will save you all the up and down adjustment time. The table listed in the installation instructions document has a maximum and minimum ride height from hub to fender. This is listed for each model, as well as a corresponding thread distance for that height. The thread distance we're talking about there is the distance between the upper and lower small locking collars. Note that 1 inch adjustment in the thread does not equal 1 inch height adjustment. This ratio is dependent on the model and suspension geometry. Please refer to the table in the installation instructions document when adjusting ride height. The listed thread distance is going to be the distance between the small locking collars. So if I go to the table and decide that I want to be at a height that needs 50 millimeters of thread, I simply measure 50 millimeters down from the upper locking collar to the lower locking collar. Then I spin the lower locking collar to that distance and spin the lower mount back up to meet the locking collar. This collar is a little easier to tighten after the coilover is on the car and the mount is stationary. We find it is always a good idea to use 2 hands, one to hold the wrench on the coilover and the other to apply the force.